Benissimo, benissimo Enrico.
Eccomi.
Tanti auguri.
Grazie.
Dico qualche parola per presentarti e ti ringrazio moltissimo per essere con noi. Grazie mille. Io dirò qualche parola e ti darò la parola subito. Bene?
Perfetto. Io ho preparato delle slide da mostrare per illustrare la lezione.
Benissimo. Ну, дорогие коллеги, я хочу вам представить нашего уважаемого коллегу и друга, профессора Энрико Бассо. Он профессор Туринского университета, много лет работавший в Генуе, прекрасно знающий генуэзские архивы, один из лучших специалистов по генуэзской архивистике. И он любезно согласился представить эту лекцию по-английски, так, чтобы это было более для вас понятно. Поэтому я не буду говорить слишком много, может быть, в конце скажу несколько слов, а сейчас я предоставлю ему слово. So, you're welcome, Professor Basso.
Thank you. So, good evening to all, and thank you for inviting me to this lesson. I have prepared some slides to illustrate my lesson. My argument will be the importance of the Genoese documents for the history of the Black Sea area. As you know, the Genoese documents are one of the main sources for the history of the Black Sea in the late Middle Age, from 13th to 15th century. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes, we see very good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's very important to place the Genoese expansion in the Black Sea area in the main design of the Genoese expansion in the Levant and the relation with the Byzantine Empire. For the first period of the Genoese presence, from approximately 12,068 to approximately 13,065, we have a great poverty of public documents from the Genoese archives on this subject. We may use only the notes that are in the official annales, the official chronicle approved by the communal authorities, where we find the first reference to the Genoese settlement in Caffa under the year 12,068, and the other indication in the Liber Gazzarie, that is the complex of the laws of the special office, the Officium Gazzariae et Maris Maioris, that was constituted to administrate and give indication for the navigation in the Black Sea area. On the contrary, we have a lot of data coming from the notarial deeds enacted by the Genoese public notaries. We have in the archives of Genoa the most ancient cartulare, so is a register of notarial acts in the world, Giovanni Scriba, half 12th century, and in the great number of the notaries of the 13th century that we preserve in the archive, there are some notaries that acted their deeds in Caffa and other localities of the Black Sea. This part of the Genoese documentation has been very well studied and published since the 19th century. We can start with an edition of the Liber Gazzarie made by Ludovico Sauli in the HPM collection, Historie, Patrie, Monumenta, Iussu Regi Caroli Alberti Edita. It's the Italian version of the MGH of Germany. In the first volume of the Leges Municipales, published in 1838, there is the edition of the Liber Gazzarie. It's an edition of the 19th century. Maybe it will be useful to go back on this source and to study a new critical edition of this text that is fundamental not only for the Black Sea, but for all the Genoese legislation on ship and navigations. Then we have, as I have said, the notes that are in the Annali Genovesi di Caffaro e dei suoi continuatori. These are the official chronicle of the Common of Genoa from the beginning of the 12th century to the end of the 13th century. So here, under each year, we can find the events of the year. And there are some references to events of the Black Sea area, not only to Kaffa, but to other ports of the Black Sea, Trabzon, for example, and to navigation in the Black Sea and the battles between the Genoese and the Venetian one for the control of the Black Sea area, which was a very crucial area for international commerce from the second half of the 13th century to the half of the 14th century, and then we will see the situation will have changed. These acts of the notaries of the 13th century and of the beginning of the 14th century have been published initially by a great Romanian professor that was Gheorghe Bratianu, who in the 20s of the last century published the Acte de notaire génois de Pere et de Caffa de la fin du XIIIe siècle, from 1281 to 1290. This publication, that was in the form of the Regestum, was taken back by Michel Ballard some 50 years ago in a volume dedicated to the acts of les actes de Caffa du notaire Lamberto de Sambuceto from 1289 to 1290. We'll see the importance of these acts for the reconstruction of the commercial links settled by the Genoese in the Black Sea area at the end of the 13th century. Another important notary was Antonio di Ponzò, who enacted his deeds at the half of the 14th century, between 1360 and 1361, and whose acts have been published in two separate editions. One for the cartulare, the register, was in two parts, and one part was published by Geo Pistarino, the great Genoese professor, who published the last part of the cartulare for the year 36, 30, 1360, 1361. And the other part, the first one, was published by Michel Ballard in 1980 and completed the panorama of the acts of this notary, who enacted in one special location that was Chilia, a Genoese settlement at the mouth of the Danube River that had a very special importance for the contacts with the inland, Bulgaria, Romania, and also Hungary. For the Genoese, many times tried to develop a commercial route along the Danube to the Central Europe in the 14th century and again in the 15th century to bypass the Turkish problem, the Turkish bloc on the Strait area. The main book that describes the situation of this period in the Black Sea is still the book of Professor Karpov on the Empire of Trebizond. That is a very complete study of this period, not only for Trebizond and the southern shore of the Black Sea, but also for the Crimean settlements and the other ports in the Black Sea. So the Black Sea came in the attention of the Western merchants, especially from the beginning of the 13th century. As we will see, this area was preserved until that time by the Byzantine government as a reserved area of action for Byzantine merchants. And it was only when in 1204 the Byzantine Empire was reversed by the Fourth Crusade, hijacked by the Venetian and used for the interest of the Republic of St. Mark, that the Western merchants had the occasion to go in this area to use the possibility of commerce with the powers on the shore of the Black Sea. There was a precedent, but is very, very doubtful. In one treaty with Genoa of 1155, from between the Byzantine Empire and Genoa, there is a note on the authorization to the Genoese merchant to go he Rosia. We don't know if this works, if these words mean to the land of the Rus. It's very disputed, the interpretation of this special indication, because it was contrary to the general policy of the Byzantine government that, as I've said, tried to maintain the Black Sea area as a special area for Byzantine commerce without possibility for Western merchants to go in. So we can say that surely from 1204, the Pontic Basin was open to the Western, especially to the Venetian. But the Venetian found a very complicated situation in the Black Sea area because they found local powers that were hostile, like the empires of Nicaea and Trebizond, and mainly they go in the Black Sea basin just in time to testimony the arrival of the Mongols and all the troubles that were connected with the arrival of the Mongol conquerors. So the advantages for the Venetian merchants were, for this first part of the period, very, very limited. In 1261, the Genoese reversed the situation. They were thrown out from Constantinople in 1204 by the Venetian that had the monopoly on the commerce of the former Byzantine area. And so they, in 1261, signed a secret treaty with the Nicene government to overthrow the Latin Empire in Constantinople and restore the Byzantine Empire. When this was made in July 1261, the Byzantine government opened the Black Sea area to his new allies, so the Genoese could go in. And they found a very different situation from the one that the Venetian had found, because they were allies of the Byzantine, they were in neutral or good relation with Trebizond, and the Mongols were less disturbing than at the beginning of the period. Here we can see the great expansion, the rapid expansion of the Mongols in Eurasia, in northern Eurasia, from Mongolia to Rus and Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, and so on. And here we have a map of the situation post 1261. Here we can see a first reference to a Genoese presence in Kaffa, Feodosia. As I've said, the first note in the annals, in the Annales, that speaks plainly of Kaffa as a Genoese settlement is from 1268. So we have a news of the presence of Genoese merchants in this area, and that was not unpopulated. There were settlements of local people, and we know from the documents of the Genoese notaries of the 13th century, the end of the 13th century, that this first Genoese settlement in Kaffa was a settlement very oriental, commas, in his aspect, without a plan, a predisposed plan for settlement, with houses made of timber, one-story houses, fountains, gardens, and so on. And the Genoese made the defense line also made by earth and timber, only to make a limit to their new settlement. So we have a very an aspect very provisional of the settlement. There is not still the walled city of Kaffa that we see still until now. But this settlement was at the center of a very great net of commerce. As you can see, this map that is based on the contracts enacted by notary Sambuceto in 1290 shows a great number of trade routes that link Caffa with the other ports of the Black Sea area, mainly Trebizond, Sinop, and Tana, but also Kopa and other ports on the southern and eastern shore of the Black Sea. Obviously, one of the main links is with the Genoese colony of Pera in front of Constantinople. That was, as Professor Pistarino said, the real brain of the Genoese empire overseas. So, as we can see, in mostly approximately 30 years, the Genoese had constructed a real net of links, of commercial links and trade routes that connected them with the main terrestrial routes of Western Asia. You have to consider that from Trebizond departed the great route, the great commercial route for Persia and India, and from Tana, in this period, the end of the 13th century, we have the start of the great Mongolian route that linked for the first time Western Europe to China. The existence of China was very well known in Europe since the Roman time. The Romans called China Serica, the land of the silk. But no Roman had gone to China, nor the Chinese came to Rome or to the Mediterranean. So the second half of the 13th century was the first time when the European merchants could rejoin China directly. And so they opened one of the most important trade routes through the Eurasia continent. As you can see, we have a complex of sea routes that are linked through Tana and through Trebizond to the great terrestrial routes that goes to Delhi or to Beijing. These are the routes described mainly by Marco Polo in his book, but we know that Marco Polo was not nor the first nor the most important merchant to go along this way. The Genoese and other merchants were frequently present on this way. So we have as the main description of the Mongolian route one chapter of the Pratica della Mercatura of Francesco di Balduccio Pegolotti, who was an agent of the bank of the Bardi family, Bardi from Florence, who worked in the Cyprus agency of this bank and who collected the news on the commerce of Asia. And one chapter is dedicated to the travel to China, the Viaggio del Gattaio. Gattaio, Katai, Kitai was China. And it's very interesting that in this chapter, all the measures, the change of money are given in using Genoese standard. So it's probably that the source of Pegolotti was a Genoese, and that the Genoese were the main presence on this route. We know that the Western merchants were a great presence on the Mongolian route, because from this period are some China's little statues that represent Western merchant. We can see that this man is not a Chinese, he's a Western with a long nose, as the Chinese said of the Westerner, and he is dressed precisely as Pegolotti says that the Western merchant had to be dressed, with long beard, with very luxurious dress, to show wealthy and importance. But another testimony says us that the Genoese were present in great number in China. This one, this is a tombstone of a woman, Caterina dei Leoni. This tombstone was found in 1944 in Hangzhou, when the old walls of the city were destroyed, and its tombstone dated 1342. This girl, Caterina dei Leoni, was the daughter of a Genoese merchant, Dominicus dei Leoni, and she died in Hangzhou and was buried there alongside of his brother, Domenichino. So we have a family, a complete family in China. This is the sign that the Genoese merchants were not only going to make market, but to settle in China and to make commercial colonies in China. This is evident also from the style of this tombstone, that it's mixed. If you see, the writing is a perfect Gothic Latin style, but the decorations of this tombstone, the margins and the figures, are Chinese. Is the story of Saint Catherine of Alexandria depicted as a Chinese artist could have do this. So we have a real consistent presence of the Genoese on this route, and this was possible because the Genoese were present in the Black Sea area. They had their bases in the Black Sea ports. In 1365, this situation changed because the Mongol rulers were overthrown by the revolution that took the Ming dynasty on the throne, and China closed himself to the strangers. So the colonies in the Black Sea, the ports in the Black Sea, had to project again their status. The great commerce with Asia was still possible through Trebizond and through the trade routes to Persia and India. But the ports on the North Sea shore, Dana, Kaffa, Soldaia, had to rethink their role. Not more a commerce of products coming from the inland of Asia, but a commerce similar to that that was made by the Byzantine until the 13th century, a commerce with the northern lands north of the Black Sea. So the products that were commerce changed from silk and spices and other products from the east to the products of the Russian lands, timber, corn, honey, furs, wax, and so on, and also the slaves. One of the main articles of the Genoese commerce in this part of the Genoese presence in the Black Sea were the slaves from Tatar origin or Caucasian origin mainly. So we have Tatars, we have Circassians, Mingrels, Abkhazians, and so on, all well distinguished in the documents of the notaries. This second period we can divide in two parts. The first one goes from 1365, the fall of the Mongol rule, to 1453, the end of the direct Genoese government on the Black Sea ports. And for this period, we have a lot of sources coming from the public documents. The main series conserved in the Archivio Segreto found. Archivio Segreto, it's not to be translated as secret archive, but as a separate archive. It's the main significance of the Latin word secretum, separate. The main series are the Diversorum Communisianue Filce, that means separate sheets of paper collected and packed together. The original parchments in the Materiae Politicae series, and then two series of registers, the Diversorum and the Literarum. The Diversorum series, both Filce and registers, are connected to the current action of the Genoese government. The Filce contains mainly, the Diversorum Communisianue series contains mainly documents incoming in the offices of the government, letters, supplications, information, and so on. And the Diversorum registers are dedicated to the verbals of the reunions of the government, of the office's government. The Literarum are the registers where are the copies of the letters sent by the Genoese government to other destination, to other powers or personals. In the Materiae Politicae, there are the original parchments of the treaties. There are no many documents on the Black Sea area in the great series of the Literarum, of the Libriurium, the collection of the main political documents of the Genoese common. But there are many documents on the Black Sea in this series of parchments, of original parchments. For example, the two treaties made in 1380 and 1381 with the Mongols rulers of Crimea. Is a double treaty, very interesting, that for the first version is not in Latin, but in Genoese language. And in both cases, there is the mention of one interpreter that has made a translation from the Mongolian language to Genoese or Latin in the two cases. The two treaties are very, very similar. And so the first editor, Dessassi, considered them as two versions of the same treaty. But as we have said in last years, they are two very similar treaties, but they are two separate treaties with two different Mongol princes. We are in the period of the civil war in the Golden Horde, and in the months that passed from between the first treaty and the second, the government of Crimea had changed, so the Genoese had to make a second agreement with the new ruler of Crimea. All these series, as you can see, begin very late, from the end of the 14th century. In reality, Materie Politiche is a series where we can find documents from the 10th century onwards. But for the Black Sea, we have documents only from the end of the 14th century. This particular is explained by the situation, the political situation of Genoa in the 14th century. During the 14th century, the city was, and the state, for the Middle Age to speak of state is very, very difficult, but we use this word, was divided, and there were many civil wars and changement of form of government from the aristocratic common to the popular common, and the beginning of the regime of the doges. So every time the government changed and there was a revolution, many documents were destroyed in the turmoil that followed. So we have lost the greatest part of the public document, of the Genoese public documents before the last decades of the 14th century. But we have, as we will see, a great number of private documents that can give us many informations on the subject of the Genoese presence in the Black Sea. This time, the main ports of Genoese interest in the Black Sea area were Caffa, Soldaia, Cembalo, as we have seen, Trebizond, Sinop, in a limited way, Tana. Tana maintained a presence of Genoese and Venetians, but you have Professor Karpov here, that is the great specialist of Tana in the 14th and 15th century, so I leave this argument. And there is a new importance of the ports on the northwest shore of the Black Sea. So Kilia, as I said, but also Belgorod, Moncastro. and other ports that gave the possibility to have alternative ways to rejoin Western Europe through the Danube or through the Dniester and Dnieper. Particularly the Dniester way was studied by the Genoese that founded also in the 15th century a new city at the mouth of the Dniester River, Ilice, that was then taken by the Moldavians that controlled this way and didn't want to have a Genoese concurrence on this particular way that connected the Black Sea area through Moldavia with Poland and the Baltic. This was a possible alternative way that was studied in the 15th century to bypass, as I have said, the Turkish control on the straits, because until Constantinople and the straits were under Christian control, the main route for commerce through from the Black Sea area to the Mediterranean one was still the old one, the route through the straits, through the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. In this period, Kaffa changed. Kaffa, the first settlement in Kaffa, had been destroyed at the beginning of the 14th century by the Genoese themselves to prevent Tartar conquest and to cover their retreat by sea. But after a few years, the Genoese had returned, and the new Kaffa was a city different from the first one. It was a city made in a part almost of stone, with great walls of stone. We have here, this is an elaboration of the Russian plan of Kaffa taken in 1784, where we have an imagine of the city very close to the medieval one, to the medieval times. We see inside of Kaffa this part that was the citadel of Kaffa, and as you can see, this part of the city has a texture that is quite different from this part outside the walls of the citadel. This was the effect of a direct intervention of the Genoese government that in 1316 wrote a project to reconstruct Kaffa. The model is very common in Italy, is the model of the so-called Ville Nove, new towns of the Middle Age. We have a regular texture that is very, very easy to identify with the Italian models. And the Genoese government projected a very regular town with spaces dedicated to hospitals, churches, public offices, and so on. The outside part was given to the private initiative, and so there was a growth that was free. The roots, as you can see, has had no regular plan. The interesting thing is that differently from examples in the Venetian area or in the Catalan area of these projects, the Genoese didn't prevent the locals to live inside the citadel. Commonly, the Venetian or the Catalans, when they built some this kind of citadels, ordered to all the locals to go outside. The Genoese didn't make so. We find in the notarial documents many people of local origin, Tartars, Hungarians, Crimeans, also Muslims that live inside the citadel of Kaffa. There was no separation between the Latin element and the Oriental one. And we find many Westerners that lived in the outside part, in the city, in the low city. We have cases of notaries that record that the house where they lived was of an Armenian, and that their neighbors were an Alan and one Jew. There was no Jew quarter, no ghetto. And the population is very, very mixed. Also in the weddings, we have weddings between Westerner and local women. We have no prevention for contacts between the various groups in the population, and no discrimination of religious origin. The Armenian church, the Catholic church, the mosque and the synagogue were in the same quarter, and were in some cases very, very aside one of the other. This city had to be fortified, and so the problem of the fortification of Kaffa was one of the problems debated by the government, we know. And we have testimony of the intervention also of the Catholic Church to finance the construction of fortification. For example, Pope Clement VI sent some to be used for the construction of towers of the walls of this, as he said, refugium singulare Christianorum, special refuge of the Christians in Eastern lands. And these fortifications were still in good shape at the end of the 18th century. We have here a graphic description of the end of the 18th century with the walls, the sea walls of Kaffa. That shows us that at the time, a great part of the fortification of the city was still present, not demolished. And this effort for fortification was extended also to other important ports like Soldaia, Sudac. That was a very important colony. First, a Venetian emporium. We know that here the Polo family had a warehouse, and it was from Soldaia that Niccolò and Matteo, the father and uncle of Marco, started for their first voyage to China, to the Grand Khan Empire. This city was the second city of Genoese Crimea. Soldaia had a very good port, but her problem was the same condition that made her fortune on the agricultural side. The mountains on the rear of Soldaia are too high. From Kaffa, it's easier to go inside Crimea and to go to the Mongolian capital of Crimea, to Solkhat. Soldaia, it's more isolated. So this port was a port very important for other reasons. For example, from the forests of the Isla Mountains came the timber to construction, for construction of houses, of boats, ships, and to make for example, the rows of the galleys. But mainly, the Soldaia area was a very developed agricultural area, where the highness of the mountains, protecting from the north wind, consented to implant special cultivation like vineyards. The wine from Soldaia was commerced in Kaffa and other ports. We know that the vineyards in this area were considered a good investment for the bourgeois of Kaffa that invested money in buying this kind of agricultural implement. And the fortification of Soldaia are well preserved and can give us an imagine of what was the aspect of these settlements in Crimea. We may imagine the inside part, the inner part of the city, made mainly of timber houses, is the reason for which we have no preservation of the elevate part of the houses. Only the first floor was made by stone. The other parts were made in timber, like in other parts of Europe. In the Middle Age, the timber was the main resource for constructing houses. The other important port with great fortification was Cembalo, Balaclava. Cembalo had a very complex system of fortification with 3 lines of walls and towers. This made of this settlement one of the best fortresses in the Genoese Black Sea. but its importance was mainly a military importance. It was a military port from which the Genoese ships and galleys can control the activities of other ports that were not under Genoese control. And it was a very good refuge from the tempests, and it was also one of the last position of the Genoese to surrender to the Turks in 1475, mainly because of its great system of fortifications. Of all this, we have here other two images of the port of Cembalo and of the Genoese fortifications. All these fortresses and fortification were a great cost for the balance of the Genoese common, and at the half of the 15th century, this cost was practically unbearable. The common had great problems in its finance. Genoa was at war at the same time with the two great rival powers that contended the control of the Mediterranean routes. In the east, the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Sultanate, and in the west, the Crown of Aragon, that tried to construct a great empire from the Iberian Peninsula through the Tyrrhenian Islands to the southern of Italy. The King of Aragon was also King of Sardinia and Corsica, King of Sicily, King of Naples. So the Genoese had to fight with these powers, and the government had no money to sustain the government and the problems of the colonies, of the settlements in the Black Sea area. So in one reunion of the Great Council was taken a decision to give the control, the government of these settlements to a private institution, the Casa di San Giorgio, or better, the Casa delle Compere di San Giorgio, that was an institution that controlled the public debt of the Genoese common, and was the wealthy institution wealthiest institution in Genoa. San Giorgio had the resource to administrate, to finance the settlements in the Black Sea area. And being not the common of Genoa, the government thought that it would be possible that the administrator of San Giorgio could find an agreement with the Turks to preserve the Genoese settlement in the Black Sea. So for this period that goes from 1453 to 1475, we have still documents from the public series that I have mentioned before, but the main sources are that coming from the archive of the Casa di San Giorgio itself. which are related also to former years, because many documents were given to the administrator of San Giorgio with the government of the settlements. So we find documents and references back to 1374 in these documents. So to the period of the government of the common, not of San Giorgio. The main series, well known to all the students of the Moscow University, are the Massaria Cafe registers, which have been studied by Professor Karpov and his school by many years, are for which Massaria Cafe 45 registers with documents dating from 1374 to 1484, because the accountability and the interest of the payments go again in the years after the fall of Caffa in 1475 until 1484. These 45 registers are of a great shape, are registers of hundreds of pages in a great dimension. Approximately, you can imagine an A3 sheet as a single page of one of these registers, with registration that give us information on a great variety of subjects, from the expenses to political events and diplomatic agreements. For these arguments, these last arguments are important. The first two buste, envelopes, of the series of the Primi Cancellieri di San Giorgio for the colonies. These are containers that contain miscellaneous documents dating from 1416 until 1631, obviously not on the Black Sea, the last part, but the more ancient are frequently connected to the Black Sea area and the Black Sea problems, as are the registers of the series Colonie del Levante Difesa Militare, military defense of the colonies. You may take in count that not only the Black Sea colonies were given to the Banco of San Giorgio, but also the city of Famagusta in the island of Cyprus, and other sites in the Levant. So there are documents connected to these other parts of the problem, but a great number of these documents are connected to military expenses for the defense of Caffa and other settlements in the Black Sea area. And as you can see, they go from 1455 to 1502. To have a first orientation in this great number of documents is still a great and useful instrument the publication of Amedeo Vigna, Codice diplomatico delle colonie Tauro-Liguri, from 1453 to 1475, published in the second half of the 19th century, 2 volumes of the series of the Atti della Società Ligure di Storia Patria. You can find it online. It's freely disposable on the site of the society. And there you can find a great part of the diplomatic documents relating to the administration of San Giorgio in the Black Sea, not the part of the accountability. The part of the accountability is more in the studies made by Professor Karpov and his school that you can find in the various numbers of the series Pre-Chernomorie. A recent book on this subject is the book of Evgeny Kvalkov, The Colonies of Genoa in the Black Sea region. That is a useful introduction to the problem and to the documents and bibliography on the problem for people who hasn't studied still this subject. I've written in my recension that it's very useful mainly for an English-speaking public who hasn't read the great literature on the subject that is in Russian, Italian, and French mainly. The books in English on the subject are very, very few. So this is the panorama of the public and institutional documents. But as we have seen, the commerce was one of the main reasons for the presence of the Genoese in the Black Sea, and the commercial routes survived for a long time until practically the last days of the Genoese presence in the Black Sea, mainly on the southern shore, because until the fall of Trebizond in 1462, there was an open way to go to India and to Persia. And it was a way very frequently used by the Genoese and by other merchants who we find in Kaffa. The way through the lands of the empire of the White Rans, the Akkoyunlu Confederation. The Akkoyunlu were Turkmen, and they were the great eastern enemies of the Ottomans. So the Genoese and also the Venetian counted on them to slow the Ottoman advance and possibly to stop the Ottoman advance. And they maintain a great diplomatic and commercial activity in the Akkoyunlu territory. That was crucial to go to markets of great importance. We see the route departing from Trabzon and going through Erzurum to Tabriz, that was the capital of the Akkoyunlu. And from Tabriz, you had two ways, one to Central Asia, the other to India, and another possible way to India by sea from Basra. This was a route practiced by merchants of silk, precious tissues, the Persian silk was the most diffused on the European markets during the Middle Ages, before the great flourishing of the Italian production in the 15th century. But there was another kind of market that interested the Westerners in this area. That was the market of the precious stones, diamonds, emeralds, rubies, sapphires, all came from Southern Asia, from India and from Indochina. So the merchants traveled also in the 15th century through the lands of the Akoyunlu and the Timurids to go to India and to Central Asia. And of all these commerce, we have a testimony in the acts of the notaries. As I have said, the notaries are a great part of the state archives in Genoa. We have one of the most important notarial collection in the world. The Genoese notaries are, with the Venetian one and partly the Barcelonese, the fundamental source to reconstruct the Mediterranean commerce in the low Middle Age. And you have to think that if we had about a dozen of notaries for the 12th century, 150 for the 13th century, from the 14th century onwards, the number is of hundreds and hundreds of registers. Each one contains hundreds of deeds, so are a number of millions of deeds concerning every aspect of the economy and the society. Particularly the Genoese were very, very used to go to the notary for every kind of contract, even to make a contract with a surgeon or to wash the bed, the blankets of the beds. So we have a great number of notaries. Among them, there are a group of notaries that enacted in the Black Sea colonies. Not all, because from their deeds, we have the names of a great number of notaries of which we have no documents that were present in the Black Sea colonies. For example, a notary of the beginning of the 15th century, Giovanni della Baino, speaks of other 14 notaries that were in Caffa at the same time. So you can have an idea of the great number of documents. If you think that a notary can act 10, 15 documents a day, there was a number of documents enormous. We have only a part of these documents that are very, very precious. And they are the main source that we have to study the social and economic history of these settlements, because the official documents obviously speak only of government, of military, of expenses for fortification and public utility. These documents are the documents where we find the normal people that in everyday action, everyday commerce, little commerce, great commerce, commerce local or commerce at great distance. There are people who sell some things on the market of Kaffa, and other people who are going to Hamadan to buy silk. So enormous variety of subjects and of actions. A part of this notary, as I've said, was published, the part for the 13th and the first part of the 14th century was published in the at the beginning, during the last century. But the project to publish all the notaries of Kaffa was a project very long to complete. It was made by Professor Pistarino in the 70s of last centuries, and we have completed it in 2018 with a great volume in the Precernomorie series, where we have published all the notaries still unpublished for the 14th and for the 15th century. In reality, it's still there is still one notary for the 15th century that has to be published, Niccolò Torriglia. That is a very interesting notary because he was one of the testimony of the fall of Kaffa, and he had a very troublesome period after the fall of Kaffa, because he was taken prisoner by the Ottomans, taken to Constantinople, and then he managed to go to the Genoese island of Chios, and from Chios to go back to Genoa. But it was in 1483, 8 years after the fall of Kaffa, that he was he managed to go back to Genoa. So with this publication, we have an instrument that is fundamental for the history of the society of Kaffa and of the other settlements of the Black Sea, where they are cited or interested in these acts. For example, there are many acts speaking of Tana. I hope that one day also Torriglia will be published, and also the Venetian notaries of Tana will be published. So we will have a complete panorama of the surviving documents, notarial documents, Western notarial documents for the Black Sea area. And it will be possible to make a complete study of the relation between the Westerners who settled on the Black Sea shores and the people who lived there from centuries. As an example, I can speak of the language problem. We see that I've spoken of the translator from Mongolian to Latin. We can see that it's probably in the Genoese colonies that was made the Codex Cumanicus, now in the National Library in Budapest, that is the first dictionary from Mongol from Cuman, the language of the Mongols, to Latin. is the first example in Europe of this kind of dictionary. But in the notaries, we have references to a great number of interpreters of different origin for different languages. There were interpreters for Mongol, there were interpreters for Persian, and there were interpreters for Armenian. The Armenian language probably was the lingua franca commonly used by a great number of merchants across the Black Sea area, with the Cuman and with the Farsi for the contacts with the Iranic area. So only from this particular, you can understand the importance of these documents and of the complete edition of these documents to have the possibility to communicate their text to people everywhere. Obviously, the originals are ancient and fragile, so the edition can permits us to use their content without disturb these old testimonies of a story very long, very complicated, but also very, very interesting. And here I think to complete my intervention, and I thank you for the attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Basso.